This morning, we turn to our third and final point of the weekend, which is to highlight the unity among the many worlds. As you're looking at the outline, I'm only going to spend time this morning on the first point under highlighting the unity among the many worlds. To do this, we'd like to return to our opening on Friday night when we spoke about the imagination of faith. And we spoke about stirring up the embers of our symbolic consciousness. I want to say that the unity among the many worlds, among us, in this meantime of ambiguity, can be experienced on the level of symbol, through the imagination of faith, in the realm of poetry and liturgy and sacrament. And I'd like to spend my time this morning trying to explain that, how our unity can be experienced on the level of symbol and sacrament. To the extent that anything is clear, it strikes me that one of our surest obligations as religious, as prophets, if you will, in the church and in the world, is to nourish the imagination of faith, to fan the embers of our symbolic consciousness into flame. And that's something of what I mean by the second point on the outline, to which I will not be able to refer beyond mentioning it. That I've come to think that a helpful metaphor for religious life is the artistic endeavor, its agony and its ecstasy. Understanding women religious, and perhaps indeed maybe understanding all spiritual people in this postmodern time as artists of the human endeavor. Human life practiced as an art, as it's experienced in ambiguity. Let me do two things trying to highlight our unity on this level of symbol. First, let me say more about what I mean by that, try to clarify that. And that will be the longest section of what I'll do. And then secondly, in a briefer part, relate all this to what we have been saying about the worldviews. Okay. So what do I mean by saying that the unity can be experienced or can be nourished on the level of symbol? Let's get at this first through something that's very familiar to us, to all of us. If not in the terms that I'll be using, definitely in the experience I will be trying to describe. And that is sacramentality as of the essence, if you will, as a defining characteristic of Catholicism. You might not be familiar with the language I'll be using to talk about this, but we all know this experience. We are this experience. Perhaps you've been following some of the conversations that have been taking place in America magazine in recent weeks, in which Robert Bella was the most recent contributor when he picked up on Andrew Greeley's ubiquitous writings on the Catholic sacramental imagination. Robert Bella of Habits of the Heart fame, reflecting on American culture as a Protestant culture and so on. And he picks up on this rich concept that Greeley develops of the Catholic sacramental imagination. What is sacramentality? What is this thing, if you will, or what is this reality, this instinct is better, this fundamental way of interpreting the world, the lens through which we see reality as Catholics, sacramentality? Basically, it's very simple to describe and very complex to live. Basically, it simply reflects our belief and our conviction that God is good, that God is the creator, and that creation is good. Creation can embody and mediate God, the divine presence. If this were not true, the incarnation would be impossible. The incarnation is quite exactly the presence of God in creation, in history, in finite form, in human life, in a sacrament we call Jesus Christ. The incarnate, and our tradition has been a history of being reluctant to believe that. Being reluctant to believe that God is really mediated in the stuff of this world. In fact, we could say, given the fact of all that we've been talking about how historical we are rooted in time and place, the world and creation and history, human history, is God's only way to get to us, because that's the kind of creature we are, historical creatures. So the world is holy. It's coming with us into the new creation, one could say. Theologians like to refer to this as the Catholic substance, that everything and anything is potentially revelatory of God. Anything and everything can be used as a sacrament. Remember, we used to call them sacramentals? Anything and everything is potentially revelatory of God, can mediate God. The Catholic substance as opposed to the Protestant principle. And those are two helpful things to juxtapose. And to get at it, I'd like you to try a little exercise. Throw yourself back in your imagination, if you will, to the years before the Second Vatican Council. All of us can do this who are in this room. Not every group I talk to can do that. But we can all go back before the Second Vatican Council. And try this exercise. How would you contrast Catholic churches and Protestant churches? The buildings, what is in them, and what goes on in them. Now that's a trick question, because prior to the Second Vatican Council, we weren't allowed inside a Protestant church. But use your imagination. How would you contrast them? Anybody? Altar, as well as pulpit. The pulpit's there central in the Protestant church. Yes.
No statues, no candles.
Yeah, statues and candles.
In some places, no kneelers.
Statues and candles, kneelers. Yes.
Sanctuary lamp.
Sanctuary lamp, indicating what? Presence of the Eucharist. Prominence of the choir, yes.
No smells and bells.
No smells and bells, yes, that's right. Incense, bells, holy water, yes. Fixed ritual, the rituals, the vestments, you know, if you think of different language, you think of the Holy Week services where we're kneeling, we're prostrating, we're standing, we're up, we're down, we're everywhere. Exactly. And if you think about it, go back to the statues as you mentioned. It's not just one little statue, it's statues. And you've got the blue candles in front of Mary and the red candles in front of the Sacred Heart. And St. Anthony's not going to be denied, he's going to be there, and so forth. Exactly. Now you multiply that, sisters. If you go upstairs to the Catholic attic and multiply that by novenas, devotions, 40 hours, benediction, green scapulars, brown scapulars, miraculous medal. We could go on and on, couldn't we? Now, that's the Catholic substance. Anything and everything is going to get in there. What's the Protestant protest? What's that word protest in the word Protestant standing for? What do they protest about that?
All that sacramentality.
Yes, all that sacramentality is idolatrous. It can be idolatrous and superstitious, precisely. It can trick us into thinking it works by magic. That if you say the novena prayers on the 9th day, bingo. And bingo's another thing too. It can be super. We can act as if we control heaven and God. You know, I have a colleague who's a Carmelite who tells the story of after his mother died, he looked in his mother's prayer book, and there was a prayer she always said every day, reflecting Thérèse of Lisieux's wonderful insight that it's all the mercy of God, it's all the love of God. He said at the very bottom of the holy card it reads, must be prayed before 11 a.m. You see? But we're in and out of churches, 3 glory bees, 3, you know, it can be idolatrous and superstitious. Sacraments are idolatrous and superstitious when we make them too literal. When we forget, when we use them, the boundless and incomprehensible mystery they're representing. The boundless and incomprehensible mystery they're making present to us. That when we touch them, yes, we are touching the divine, but not unambiguously. Not unambiguously. We must forget that whatever it is we're holding is not precisely exactly the divine, period. Do you see? Sacraments are and are not what they symbolize. To nourish our symbolic consciousness, our imagination of faith, is to nourish our ability to hold together the multiple layers of meaning without collapsing them into one thing or another. See? Listen, tell me this novena is going to work on the 9th day or forget it. Sure. To nourish your symbolic consciousness, the imagination of faith, is to nourish an ability to hold together multiple layers of meaning without collapsing them into a dualism that says it has to be this or that, without collapsing them into literalness, do you see? Without forgetting that they're mediating a boundless and incomprehensible mystery. Nourishing our symbolic consciousness, our imagination of faith, involves a willingness to enter into a world of meaning that does not have the clarity of the literal, but which is more real than the literal. More real than the literal. Why? Because it encompasses more of reality than the literal can do. Let me offer 3 examples to clarify the inherent ambiguity in symbols, in sacramentality. First of all, let's go to Holy Saturday. And imagine yourself, as probably many of you have served, as a sacristan. All there is to do on Holy Saturday is all the symbols the church is going to use, and it's genius for this. And you finish all your preparations, everything's in place, and you're ready to go home and put your feet up for a few minutes. And you realize, my goodness, this sacristy floor is a mess. So you go over to the tap in the sacristy and you wash the floor up, and then you go home and rest. That night, later on, during the Easter Vigil when the church is gathered, the whole church, from the time of Jesus to today, the whole church, everywhere on the face of the earth, gathered with your little gathering. That tap water comes out again. That tap water comes out and is poured into a huge basin, blessed. And now what is it? It's tap water. But it's holy water. Now it's the waters of the chaos of creation out of which God creates. Now it's the waters of the River Jordan. Now it's the waters of the Red Sea through which the liberating action of God happens. Now it's the waters of baptism, the same waters in which Augustine was baptized, and Mother Teresa and Mother Caroline and you. And it is that water more really than if you went to the Jordan and brought some, than if you went to the Red Sea and brought some. It's still tap water. But oh no, it isn't. It's holy water. It's the water of life. But you see that ambiguity? It's tap water. But no, it isn't. We have to hold that together. The second example I'd like to give of the inherent ambiguity concerns creation and nature, and how sometimes we tend to, especially when we are given to creation spirituality, we can tend sometimes to glorify and exalt it and forget the ambiguity. Body, nature, creation stuff, bread, wine, oil, touch, flesh, these are all the stuff of sacraments, but it's not unambiguous. It's not under our control. Our experience of body, nature, and creation is not all exquisite pleasure and delight. Recently, I was in the home of some friends who have an entire room set aside for fitness and exercise equipment. You can tell I don't visit them very often. while I was there, I heard the moans and groans coming from the room in which their teenage son was exercising. And I said, I recognize that sound. That's what I sound like when I get out of bed in the morning. And I think bodiliness is not just delight. It's also vulnerability and mortality. It's also illness and decay and death. It's also sometimes the sick to deathness we experience, just being tired of our finitude. Tired, of doing the washing the dishes, and you only have to do it again a few hours later or the next day. Sick to death of finitude, of this limit. Ambiguity in the very bodiliness, nature, and creation that are used for sacraments. Do you see that? The third example of ambiguity in living with a sacramental imagination involves what Susan Ross, in her wonderful new book on feminist sacramental theology, calls moral ambiguity. And I want to refer to our yesterday's profound discussion of the pain that surrounds the celebration together of the Eucharist. The deep pain some of our women feel because they find themselves not wanting to go to Eucharist because of the exclusion of women from presiding, because celebrations of the Eucharist often do not nurture on that deep level of meaning which the liturgy is intended to embody. The pain of some of our women who do not feel that way, who do not feel excluded, but feel judged because they are able to attend Eucharist and find it does nurture that deep level of meaning for them. It was a wonderful conversation we had yesterday. But I have been helped in this question or this matter by two things. First, I was enormously helped by Mary Collins' address in 1991 to the LCWR, in which Mary Collins challenged the leaders of religious in this country not to fall into a symbolic reductionism, forgetting the ambiguity of the sacrament. Her point was that defining the Eucharist solely in terms of gender roles and power relationships, allowing that to operate as the dominant meaning of the Eucharist, reduces the Eucharist. It resolves the ambiguity and does not allow it to function as a sacrament. No matter which side wins in any one celebration of the Eucharist, as you're planning it, this side wins or that side wins, the fundamental meaning of the Eucharist is lost if it is reduced to gender roles and power relations. Let me quote her directly, because it did help me. She writes, quote, "The strong sign of the assembly of outcasts and strangers, people so unlike that they would never choose one another's company, being invited to welcome and to forgive one another in Jesus' name, to be at peace, to sin no more, is suppressed when we reject ambiguity and demand clarity and coherence in our ecclesial relationships before we can celebrate the Eucharist." I found that very helpful. It might help some of you. But the second thing I've been helped in, the second way I have been helped, is by Mary Irving. In the course of our years on the, it feels like years, on the Theological Development Committee, Mary has helped me to hear and to see much more deeply this pain. And we have had conversations, sometimes in tears and pain, over this. But what a grace that has been. Not that I'm sure in the course of the ongoing years of our working together on theological development we will not have more differences. But every future conversation we have will now be borne up by the mutual respect and affection we have for one another because we hung in there and talked about this at that level. Sisters, if we can talk to each other on these very deep level about our differences, we will renew the congregation and thereby transform the church and the world. That's why we're going into this process of theological development and reflection, to give us a context and a language and a depth to enable us to talk to one another on these levels. It's not just an inner SSND thing we're about, because if we renew the congregation on that, in that way, toward mutual respect and affection, we will transform the church and the world. Thereby we will transform the church and the world. Otherwise, if we're not able to talk to one another on that level, the best we will ever be able to hope for is a polite tolerance of one another. Last night's Eucharist with the Chautauqua community and the parish community which their church serves. How can the imagination of faith bring about unity among us? How did it last night? Let's use that as a concrete example. Our experience last night of going there after we had that conversation. I'm sure there was a tremendous variety of the kinds and levels of symbolic consciousness at work there. I went through several levels of it during the Eucharist just inside myself. What enables us to be one? Well, theologians use the terms first and second naivete to help us get at this. When we are young and growing up in the faith, we experience what they call the first naivete, where the symbols work for us quite literally. Remember when we were young? I mean, we wanted on the 9th day of the novena to have the answer, didn't we? It worked quite literally for us. But as we grow older, and particularly as we begin to read and perhaps study theology or begin to read spirituality and get more critically into it, but we don't even have to do that. It's really as we go older and have experiences, we have to pass through sometimes a very long and dark tunnel of being critical about that faith. I mean, after all, what happens when on the 9th day of the novena the grace isn't given? I remember one time on a retreat being given to pray that passage, you will pass through the raging waters, you will pass through the fire, and you won't get burned. And I said to the director, I've been burned. You know, what do you do with that? See? And after a process, one emerges out of that experience of darkness into what they call the second naivete, where the symbols can work for you again, only now on a quite transformed level. Now, one does not go through this only once in a lifetime. This is a process of life. But how can that level of symbol be our unity? We can all be there together. Those who are experiencing this Eucharist or this sacrament or this prayer together on the level of first naivete, and those who are there on the level of second naivete. And even, God bless us, those who are struggling in the dark night, pining for the first naivete and praying for the second naivete. Do you see? On that level, our unity can be there. You see? Let's look at, in my second point now, let's look at the chart on the three worldviews and try to relate this, what we've been saying, to the three worldviews. Look first at the pre-modern and recall what we said about that regarding order and harmony. But consider this. In relation to the imagination of faith, the sacramental theologian Regis Duffy talks about our progressive loss of symbolic consciousness during the pre-modern era. He says, if you go back to Augustine, one of Augustine's gifts, very early in the tradition, was he allowed for the complexity of God's mystery in what he wrote about the sacraments. It was Augustine who said those wonderful things. It is you yourself on the altar. Augustine had a sense, it's the presence of Jesus Christ. It's the body and blood of Jesus Christ. When you receive it, you're receiving the church as well, the full body of Christ. And he had a wonderful sense of mystery. But as the pre-modern era developed into the Middle Ages, over the centuries, the tendency grew to try to explain how does the mystery work. That's what sacramental theology evolved into. How does this mystery work? Now, Thomas Aquinas did that with tremendous subtlety and sophistication. But lesser minds made Thomas into a stultifying description of how the mystery works, you see? So we can see in the pre-modern era, there was, from Augustine's time and the origins of the church, a progressive loss of this kind of symbolic consciousness I'm talking about now. Do you see that? In the modern era, if we take a look at that for a moment, remember we said reason and science were the things we wanted to always think about when we hear about modernity. There was a book written in 1985 by Donald Levine called The Flight from Ambiguity. The Flight from Ambiguity. And he demonstrates in that book how the modern world has grown increasingly hostile to ambiguity. And if you look at it in terms of reason and science, you can see what he means. Scientific knowledge becomes the paradigm of what true knowledge is. If you can't show me, if you can't lay it out in an experiment, if you can't put it in my hand, it isn't true. It isn't really real. You see? Well, that flies right in the face of what we try to mean by symbolic consciousness. That thoroughgoing rationalism of modernity makes symbolic consciousness very difficult. Impossible, really. If the only really valid way of knowing is objectively, scientifically, you know, if what you can experience in the sense of touch, encounter with your senses is the only thing that's real, then love is not real, fidelity is not real, mystery is not real. It's all lesser. It's all pushed to the side in terms of what matters. Whereas in postmodernity, I think one of the gifts is that ambiguity is our very condition. We have an openness in postmodernity to this symbolic consciousness if we can nourish it, because there's no getting away from the ambiguity. And it's interesting that science itself, that is the so-called new science, with chaos theory and uncertainty principle, and showing us the interrelatedness of all things at the heart of reality, all of these things have converged to have science say to us, listen, whether you like it or not, mystery is at the heart of reality. See? So science helps us today, if you will, develop and nourish this imagination of faith. The uncertainty principle that theoretically mystery at its heart is mysterious. Reality at its heart is mysterious. Let's go back again to each of the three worldviews in another, and this will be my concluding run through these worldviews, another perspective on this, which is to focus in on ambiguity. Remember what we said about the order and the harmony of the pre-modern classical world and the exquisite beauty that's undeniable there. That beauty has a darker side. That order has a darker side. It is a God-centered worldview, but the certitude and the timelessness of it is inhuman. The timelessness of it, the universality, the lack of recognizing that time enters into everything we are and do is inhuman. Remember that the ending of Levertov's poem from yesterday, we must breathe time as fishes breathe water, and that the classical world did not always remember that. Also, in the classical world, an element of its darker side is there was no room for diversity and pluralism. To be a citizen of Christendom, even the word Christendom, to be a citizen of the culture and to be a member of the church were one and the same. And so at best, Jews and Muslims, for example, were marginalized at best. At worst, they were persecuted. And those glorious cathedrals we talked about yesterday, and their magnificent outpouring of human effort and creativity, they also have a darker side. On the facade of Notre Dame, you can see the image, both in female figure, of the church and the synagogue. And the church figure is represented as a vibrant woman, young, energized. And the synagogue is represented as a blindfolded woman with head cast down and arms bound. Now you can say, well, you know what they were trying to say about, but Still, images are powerful, aren't they? This is the point I want to make with that. The pre-modern classical worldview was ambiguous, but, and this is the most important thing, it didn't know it. It wasn't self-consciously ambiguous, you see? The modern world, from this perspective, pretended that such a thing was possible as value-free knowledge, that pure objective science is not only possible, but it's a value. As if nothing of the human observer, the human scientist, enters into his or her experiments. The prejudices, the inability to see what they're experimenting because of blind spots were ignored in the trust and confidence that the scientific method would produce pure knowledge, value-free. In this sense, modernity too is ambiguous and didn't know it, is not conscious of the limits of reason. And one of the reasons it collapses is that the limits of reason became apparent in our century. When you go to postmodernity on this question, ambiguity is self-conscious. We can't avoid it. And the ambiguity we experience is not to be resolved, even, science tells us, theoretically, not even if we try really hard. In our loss of innocence in this century, with the breakdown of the excessive optimism and progress of modernity, we have ambiguity around us all the time. The other side of the interrelatedness and the mystery at the heart of reality that science shows us is also fragmentation. If everything is interrelated, that means that there's no single way of expressing the truth for every possible situation, because everything is interrelated in ways that are difficult to grasp. I'll give you one quick example. I have a colleague whose grandmother came over, emigrated to this country, and she came over on a ship with a few other women, and they were all sick, and on the hull of the ship. And they came up one day when they were feeling a little better. Two of them came up and decided to get a little fresh air. And my friend's grandmother said, I'm going to go down and see how the rest of them are doing. And she went down, and within moments, a wave came unexpectedly, passed over the surface of the ship, carried that woman away, and she was never seen again. Now, if it hadn't been for the chance that she decided at that moment to go down, my friend wouldn't exist. It's impossible for us to know all of the circumstances that contribute to our being in any one time and place. See? It's impossible to say something, to know that with any absoluteness. There's no absolute, unmovable foundation of knowledge. And this is where the pre-modern world enables us to be open to the imagination of faith, to the mystery of God, which is incomprehensible and unnameable. And you know, that's not unambiguous either. It's this openness to the mystery of God that postmodernity enables us to make so apparent is also coupled with the fact that we can't deny this unnameable evil that we have experienced in our century. God's presence as this mystery is more often than not experienced as an absence, as a hiddenness. And more often than not, our spirituality is a suffering unto God in our time. Ambiguity itself not unambiguous.
I'm going to begin my observations on the unifying dimension of symbol by referring to those three principles that Mary started with in terms of Catholic sacramentality, that God is good, and creation is good, and God is present in creation. And I'd like to take that a step further and say that the way God can be present in creation to us as the human creation is because God has created us to be symbolic creatures. I don't know if you remember I think it was Aristotle who said that the salient point of humanity is that he would have said man. We would say the human person is the person who laughs. And then we had the creature composed of body and soul as the definitions of humanity. And I would say that the contemporary definition of what it means to be human is to say that the human person is the one who seeks meaning in life, and that meaning is only accessible to us because we are created with what is called a symbolic consciousness. We receive symbols from the outside, and we make meaning of them. And there are also symbols inside us, and I'll be touching into that also. And it is in the working out of those symbols that we live and that we grow as human persons. And so it's no accident that the Church, the Catholic Church, is sacramental, because the God who redeemed us in church created us to be sacramental, created us to be symbol creatures. As Mary said, these symbols both reveal and conceal God, and they are also ambiguous. But I want to focus this morning for a while on how the symbols open us to the wells of meaning in our lives. You might say that the symbols we deal with are like, what shall I say, the bucket that you are able to deep down go in a well to bring up the living water. Because without meaning, you have the alienation and the isolation that we have touched into at different points in the weekend, and the despair that comes when there is no meaning. I had a profound experience about 15 or 20 years ago when I was giving a workshop to a group of sisters of another congregation, and one of them asked to see me individually. And as we spoke, it was clear that she felt very isolated, and she said to me with great passion, "I don't want to die without having anybody know who the person is me, who is me has lived." And I found so deeply touched by that, because in a sense she knew there was a self inside there, but for whatever reason, whether it was her inability or the kind of ambivalence or ambiguity of the atmosphere of the community that didn't allow that deeper inner sharing. You know, Mary talked earlier this morning about if we just keep at the level of exchanging platitudes with each other, we're not going to grow, we're going to stagnate and die. If we don't challenge ourselves to go that step deeper ourselves and to create a climate where others will both give and receive respectfully at that deeper level, we too are going to stagnate and die. Now let's take a look for a few minutes at this whole question of symbols. A symbol can be a profound one, but it can have a meaning in it that might be alive for us. It can have a profound meaning in it, but that meaning might be sleeping inside us and it hasn't been awakened. Or sometimes symbols die, the meaning in symbols. And sometimes a symbol will have all of those at the same time. You might take the Eucharist as an example of a profound symbol with different levels of meaning in it. And again, to use the examples that we've been touching into, for some, Eucharist is vibrant and full of meaning. Others are on a journey to struggle to find the meaning which for them is still asleep. And others are in the dark night of saying the symbol of Eucharist has died for me. The same thing can happen with the cross. Some of our sacred symbols can be at those different levels in different people and different cultures. Sometimes people say, I don't have any symbols. It's just dark and empty. But those are symbols. Darkness is a symbol. Silence is a symbol. So even when we say God is silent, or God is dark, or I feel emptiness, to use the obvious ones that you would kind of say God is not there, we can't help speaking in symbolic language. We can, I think, for our purposes, look at symbols from two different points of view, the internal and the external. And I would just name as the internal the symbols that appear to us in dreams. Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, and that is the source of our symbolic life. And our scriptural tradition tells us dreams are a way to access God. And I don't think it also always has to be a dream that says, take the child and get out of here. You know, the mystery of our dreams is something that some of us are moving toward, others of us aren't aware yet, and some of us are deeply reverence and would maybe use a time of prayer to reflect on the symbolism which emerges in our dreams at night. One of Carl Jung's most useful, it has to be a hypothetical structure, but I think it has merit to it, is his theory of archetypes. That within our psyche we carry the images and symbols of the race that has preceded us. And for example, the ancient father image, the ancient mother image, and many others. And he would say they're acting in us, and it can behoove us to pay attention to that. The feminist psychologist Jean Shinola, I'm sorry, I forget her name right now, Bolin, I think, has a book in which he takes the classical Greek and Roman archetypes of women and says, be careful, because you could be acting out Athena or acting out Juno and not even know it if you're not attentive to what's going on and able to keep that archetype as an archetype but not let it overtake you. I want to say something about the essential relationship between symbol and reason. Because we are symbolic creatures, but the meaning we attach is where our reason comes in. We say, oh, this is probably what that dream meant. Or I think this is something about what this Nama workshop at Chattawa meant. This is what it was all about. So symbol and reason are not enemies. They are really indispensable to each other if we are going to grow as humans with all of our, so to speak, human psychic equipment, which we then can use here in terms of theology and spirituality. Denise Levertov, who is poetry Mary has used, has a wonderful poem, and I'm sorry I can't remember the name of it, but I can give you the gist of it. She talks about the hour before dawn, and she talks about the last shadows of night as the wings of a great bird, which are kind of fading as the day comes. And she gives you a sense of the holiness of night. And then, in effect, she says, and then that day with its clarity arrives, and we have to live in the light. It's really a turnaround, because often we think of darkness as negative. And I think that maybe some of what she's getting at is what Mary referred to about the loss of symbolic consciousness, both in the church and in the West, so that she's lamenting, perhaps, the loss of attentiveness to the depth of darkness because we have sort of canonized the light of reason. And so when I talk about the essential relationship, I'm talking about the ability to try to get those more in balance. A lot of that depends on how much we have been marked by the Western tendency to over-rationalize. Some of it also depends on our inner psychic makeup. Some people are just made to appreciate symbol more quickly. Others have to work harder at it. And so as we, as SSNDs, perhaps respond and try to respond to Mary's challenge to us to move in this area in order for unity, we will not find it all easy going, you know. We'll find some people who would think it would be a waste of time, perhaps, to spend a prayer time looking at light or some other kind of nature image or a human culture image, and not see, well, why are we wasting time doing this? Because accessing symbols is takes longer sometimes than accessing reading or concepts. Now, sometimes concepts can be hard enough, can't they? But symbols can be even difficult. And for those of us who are Western and North American, we like things to happen quickly. And if it doesn't happen fast, well, it isn't worth anything. And symbols are only accessible if we discipline ourselves to take time. I think we could also probably say that taking this darkness and light image a little bit, it's not a bad way to look at theology and spirituality, because symbols are only accessed through experience, through human experience. Friday night, when we did those reflection questions, you may recall that there was a question on there about, does any symbol come to you about where you've been and where you are now and where you're going? We didn't attend to that question when we did specifically in the small groups, but you can think back and say to yourself, did I even see that question? You know, and if I did I just kind of say, oh, I don't know, I don't have time to think about that. You know, that kind of question is the question that's trying to get at the inner experience, the place where the unity can take place, to access the symbol. I would also say that in the little sketchy outline I gave of theological reflection yesterday, that's one of the elements of the first part of the triangle. When you're accessing, when you're trying to get in touch with whatever this experience is that you've had, you do want to look at the externals of the experience. Who are the people? Where is the setting? But you want to look at the internal part too. What are my feelings about this? And are there any symbols or images or metaphors that can sum up what it is I am experiencing? See, so if you do that, you're getting down to the deeper level, at that experience level, whether it's individually in prayer or communally in local community or other prayer, or whether it's in the process of theological reflection. So you could say that spirituality is a little closer to symbol because it takes experience as its starting point. Theology, fundamentally, I would say, takes reason as its starting point. But we don't, I can't remember if I mentioned this yesterday, Sandra Schneider's has a great article called Spirituality and Theology, Strangers, Enemies, or Partners. And her thesis is that they're partners. That we don't downgrade theology by saying, oh, well, you know, spirituality is really where it's at, and vice versa. We don't downgrade spirituality and say we have to understand clearly. Things have to be analyzed so that we see the patterns. Both are true and both need each other. And we have had a wonderful example of that in this weekend with the way Mary has presented her conceptual material and interspersed it with poetry and art, inviting you to use both reason. So it's not that a theologian can't incorporate the spirituality aspect, and it's better and more effective, I think, when it is done that way. But it still is possible at least to, this is the spirituality now using reason, say there is such a thing as spirituality and there is such a thing as theology. And in our 4-year program, we will hope to be reverencing both of those elements. I'd like to say a little bit now about where are the places that we can be attentive to the symbolic in our lives, sort of coming to the practical application of this. It seems universal that almost all retreat houses are built in a place where nature is beautiful. And there's a good reason for that, because for so many of us, even if we're lost in the harassing bustle of urban life, still we can be moved by a sunset. Several of us noticed the glorious sunset and moonrise last night. We interrupted the party to go to the window and look. There's something about those sacramental symbols of nature which touch our symbolic conscience more easily than other symbols do. And so it's always, I think, a gift to be able to find ways to allow them to touch us either when we are on retreat or in the ordinariness of our lives. You know, not to think that we can't attach the symbolic until we go on retreat. That's not true. Another way to be attentive to symbols is through culture. And we've done that this weekend. Through the arts. Sometimes a profound way to touch your symbolic consciousness is to read a good novel or short story, to see a good movie or television presentation, to visit an art museum, to have a good piece of sculpture. You may have to go visit it if you can't afford it. But at any rate, the human artistic creations can touch our symbolic consciousness and evoke depth and meaning in us that really probably can't be evoked any other way. Our tradition as Catholics is another way, and Mary did touch on that, so I will try to touch a couple of places where she didn't touch. One is the scriptures. The profound images of journey, of well, of water, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Those are just a few examples of the way the biblical literature is just jam-packed with profound symbols. The Eucharist is another one. And I would like to make an observation on the allusion that Mary made to Mary Collins's address to the LCWR, because I too read that address. And I found myself with a little bit different responses to hers, so I'd like to present my responses briefly as an alternative way or an individual way to look at it. I think what Mary was essentially saying was that if you, as Mary said, if you reduce the Eucharist to just gender or power struggles, then you're missing the ambiguity of Eucharist. And as someone who finds it difficult to attend Eucharist, I was mightily challenged by her statement. But as someone who also respects experience, I had to say, I think there's something else to say about that, because some of the experience might be sufficient pain at the sinfulness that's incarnate in the clerical male structures, that it's not just a political issue or a surface issue, it's a profound suffering. And one has to be very careful and respect oneself as to how much suffering you can allow yourself to have. And I thought that Mary's interpretation could be read as saying, no matter how tough it is, well, you have to go, you have to attend. And I don't really think that's always true. I think that has to be a judicious discernment on the part of people for whom this is sometimes a dark night. And a question of saying, how many dark nights can you go to in a week? You know, is one practical way of looking at it. The third way in which our Catholic tradition, I think, can help us is our SSND tradition. I thought of a few quotes from Mother Teresa and Mother Caroline that I think would just be touching the surface, where Mother Caroline says, do not look forward with anxious care, but upward in a spirit of faith and love. That's a powerful image, powerful symbol, if you stop and think about it for a minute. Of course, Mother Teresa's famous saying about the roots are deeper and the flowering the lovelier. What a wonderful symbolic image. You know, we often say it, and most of us reverence it, and sometimes we groan when the suffering is really tough. But sometimes we maybe don't always attend sufficiently to the power. We are touched by it, but there might be more depths we could go into the power of letting the image of roots and flowering sink into our psyche and just have kind of some silent interior prayer, allowing that image to plumb depths that we never knew were there. So another way to look at ambiguity, I think, is we are made to be almost infinite, and so that's why every person is a mystery, and our self is a mystery to us. We never know how much more is there. And so we never really finish with symbols. And finally, the lovely passage from Mother Teresa that I came across in the CD that Mary Meyer brought to my attention. It was the music that was performed when Mother Teresa was inducted into the Bavarian Hall of Fame. And one of the pieces is a series of Mother Teresa sayings, and one of them is the roots, and the flowering. But this one, I think, is another lovely one that might be able to unify us no matter where we are in our worldviews. It's called, she says, "Follow the star, and it will surely lead you to Jesus." And while people might have trouble, or I shouldn't say trouble, but diversity in terms of the symbol of Jesus, following the star taps into a symbol that could perhaps help us talk about our experience of God, wherever that experience might happen to be on the range of pre-modern or modern or postmodern views of God. Just in summary, I guess I would say, for the interior symbols, if we think about attending to our dreams, and if you feel called that way, to learn a little bit more about archetypes. And to say, are they active in me and I don't know it? How can they work for my growth as a woman of faith who is an SSND? To attend to the symbols that are right in our everyday experience. That's probably one of the hardest things to do, because we tend to have a meat and potatoes attitude toward our experience, I think. And to find the time to let the profound experiences of the day, or even not necessarily profound, but significant, to allow them to speak to us and say, what's going on? How can I allow that to touch my heart more deeply? To do that in prayer, to do that in faith sharing, whether that be in local community or larger SSND groups or with good friends. And as I said, because this is new to us, to many of us, to perhaps realize that, we can't go home from this weekend and say, okay, let's jump into profound, deep sharing with symbols, tomorrow morning at prayer. But to recognize the reality of the community that we are living with or praying with, and to nurture a symbolic appreciation, being respectful of where each person is and expecting that it will take time.